Hey everybody, and welcome to Crazy Tech Lab. Sorry I haven't been around for a little bit, but I had a nasty throat infection which needed to clear up before I got back on camera. Thankfully that's all gone now. Water under the bridge. It's winter, these things happen, but I'm back now, which is what counts, obviously. So this video is all about these things, M.2 SSDs. So I've got a lot of questions over the last year on my channel about these things. People asking where they go on your motherboard, which one should I choose, do I need to cool it properly, all that kind of stuff. Now, I absolutely love M.2 SSDs for a number of reasons. They're super fast, they're easy to install, they take up very little space in your PC, and they don't have any cables, which means they're great for small form factor PCs as well, mini ICX systems. So the video today, though, is going to be focusing on those things. So where to install them, how to pick the best one for you, how to make sure it's compatible with your hardware, and how to make sure that it's cooled properly as well, which is especially important with PCI Express 4 and PCI Express 5 SSDs. And I think a lot of the confusion that's coming at the moment is coming from the fact that we have 3 generations of SSDs out there. We've got PCI Express 3, 4, and 5 SSDs existing all at the same time, and I can appreciate that that can be a little bit scary when you have to go out there and buy something for either your existing system or a new one. So we're going to be looking at all of that today, and this video is kindly sponsored by MSI, who's thrown a couple of motherboards our way to have a look at and to basically play with some SSDs and see what you need to do, what hoops you need to jump through to make sure you get the right SSD for you and to have your system up and running optimally. So that's it for the first part of this video. We're going to move on to all the steps just in a minute, but I'd like to ask you to subscribe to my channel first of all, and don't forget to turn on notifications. If you find this video informative, then definitely give me a like and a comment. Just helps punch me through the algorithm and gets me noticed and helps me keep on doing videos like this, basically. So like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll be very, very happy. So let's move on. So here we have 3 very different motherboards, and the kind of choices that you need to make with these 3 motherboards are pretty much the choices that you'll need to make with any motherboard out there right now in terms of which M.2 SSD you are going to need to pick. So starting at this side, we've got the MSI MAG X670E Tomahawk Wi-Fi, and the X670E chipset is basically the flagship chipset for AMD Ryzen 7000 series CPUs, and one of the main benefits of this chipset is that this port here, on this board at least, supports PCI Express 5 SSDs. So they are the super fast SSDs, the latest PCI Express version of SSDs, and essentially they can dish out data well above 10,000 megabytes a second. In fact, some of the latest ones that are being released at the moment can actually handle over 14,000 megabytes a second. So if you need crazy speeds and you have the money to spend on them, because they are very, very expensive for the amount of storage that you get, you will need one of these motherboards. But it's also worth remembering that premium motherboards like this also come with other M.2 ports. There are 2 underneath here, and there's one out on its own down here, down the south end of the board. And while the motherboard supports PCI Express 5 on one slot, it won't support it on the rest of them, just the way that this thing is wired up and links through to the chipset and also to the CPU. So just worth bearing that in mind, that if you do have one that supports a super fast SSD in one port, it won't necessarily support it in the other ones. In fact, these ones all support PCI Express 4, so they are slightly slower. They are also backwards compatible. All of these slots, all 4 slots on this board, are backwards compatible with PCI Express 3 as well. So that's another thing to remember, is that if you have one really, really fast port with the latest standard, at the moment it's PCI Express 5, that port is backwards compatible with older SSDs. Now, moving down to the middle of the pack here, and we've got the MSI B760M Gaming Plus Wi-Fi motherboard. This is for Intel CPUs, and it's what I'd consider probably a low-end or a mid-range motherboard, depending on what your budget is. And obviously no overclocking on this motherboard, but we're primarily concerned with M.2 SSDs. And what we've got here are just 2 ports on the PCB, one here and one here. Now, mid-range, you're not going to get PCI Express 5 support. That's gone. You're not going to see that. In fact, on Intel motherboards at the moment, there's very limited PCI Express 5 support, and AMD was the first one to support that as well, I believe. So here, PCI Express 4, nothing wrong with that at all. I would consider that a decent sort of base mark or baseline for the performance that you'd expect from an SSD. So some of these SSDs, they're churning out around 7,000 megabytes a second. We've got a PCI Express 4 SSD here in the WD SN850. So these are pretty much your standard M.2 ports, and again, they are backwards compatible with PCI Express 3. So if you want to go for a high capacity PCI Express 3 in that slot, and a more modern PCI Express 4 M.2 SSD in the top slot, which is where the heatsink is as well. We'll get more into heatsinks a bit later and how to actually install it. Then that's generally okay. So there are going to be some motherboards that might not support PCI Express 4 though on both of the chips, on both of the ports, and that's definitely worth watching out for. So for example, say you wanted to go for two PCI Express 4 SSDs, one for storage and one for your programs and Windows. Sometimes it's common for people to do that with content creation as well. You have one fast SSD to run your program off, you have another fast SSD to house all your video files or photo files and all that kind of stuff. Just make sure that both ports support it, and we'll talk more about how you can actually work that out later when we look at the motherboard websites. Now, this is where things get a little bit more interesting, because down here, we've actually got a much older motherboard. I'll just bring to the center for the moment. And this is the MSI Z490 Carbon EKX. So it's put a thermal pad down there. This actually had a water block on it earlier, so I just wanted to leave that thermal pad on there for now. So it doesn't come like that, which is why the VRMs are exposed at the top as well. But this it was available in a standard model. It was just one of the older motherboards that I had lying around. So this is where things get interesting, as I say, because with this motherboard, you're going sort of pre-PCI Express 4, or actually directly on the split of it here, because this motherboard with a 10th gen CPU, which I've actually got in there at the moment, that's a Core i5 10600K. This motherboard didn't support PCI Express 4. However, if you use a PCI Express 4 compatible CPU, such as a Core i5 11600K, i.e. an 11th gen processor, this motherboard would, because it linked through to the CPU and it needed PCI Express lanes from the CPU to power the M.2 port up here. So this is a great example where you have to pay really close attention as to what M.2 SSDs the motherboard is actually capable of, and we're going to have a look in a minute just how the wording goes on the website to actually decipher that and work out which one you need to get. Because on this board, if you pick this board up on eBay, which you probably would have to now, it's not available anymore, but it's still probably loads of them out there, and loads of Z490 motherboards out there, and people looking to upgrade their SSDs or put an M.2 SSD in there for the first time. That's where you need to be really, really careful, because some of these boards don't even support PCI Express 3. Obviously, if you're going older than this, so if you're going with a 300, 200, 100 series chipset from Intel for 9th gen CPUs, 8th, 7th, 6th, 5th gen, if you're going all the way back far, with AMD going back as far as the 300 series chipsets, then a lot of those, or most of those, don't support PCI Express 4 at all. So you need to make super, super sure your motherboard supports it. And what we're going to do now is have a look at a motherboard's website to see how you actually work that out using these specifications, because it's really, really important before you buy a motherboard or you buy an SSD that you make sure that everything is compatible. So here we are at the product page of one of my favourite motherboards at the moment, which is the MSI MPG Z790i Edge Wi-Fi. Excellent mini ITX motherboard for anyone that's interested in that stuff, and it's a pretty good board to look at because it's got a few different things that we want to talk about when you are trying to identify whether or not your M.2 SSD is going to be compatible with your motherboard and which port you want to actually install it into. So what you want to do first is head down here to the storage section, and this will be very, very similar on other motherboards and manufacturers as well. So what you want to do is identify the different ports on the motherboard. They're actually listed here as M.2 1, 2 and 3. I think 1 and 2 are probably on the top side, and 3 is on the rear of this particular motherboard, which is quite common to happen on a mini ITX motherboard to save space. And we can see that there are a couple of different specifications here. So we've got PCI Express 4 on 2 of the slots, but the second slot only supports PCI Express 3, and this is on a brand new motherboard. So this motherboard is pretty much the flagship mini ITX motherboard for MSI. It's one of the best motherboards out there, but you still get at least one port which is limited to PCI Express 3. So obviously you don't want to fit your PCI Express 4 M.2 SSD into that slot because it will run much slower than it would otherwise. Now, this port is also pretty interesting because it has a SATA mode. Now, SATA is both an interface and a bus or controller which your SSD can use to communicate to the rest of your system. Now, I've had a lot of people get very confused over how SATA can be on an M.2 SSD and that kind of thing. I've had people complain in my reviews when I've said, you know, this port supports SATA M.2 SSDs as well, and they think, no, you're completely wrong, that doesn't exist. They do. I wouldn't recommend that you buy them, because while they're still reasonably fast, but they're no faster than a standard SATA SSD, you know, the 2.5-inch ones that you can fit into your case. But here it just uses the M.2 interface to connect to the SATA controller on your motherboard. So it's limited to about 500 megabytes a second, which is pretty slow by today's standards. But you can do it. So if you are transplanting an older SSD into your new system and you want just like a bit of extra storage, then you can still do that on some modern motherboards using the M.2 interface. Now, other things you might want to be aware of are where these ports are located on your motherboard. You'll have to look at your motherboard's manual to identify where they are and also which one is which. So here we can see if we've got a PCI Express 4 SSD, you can house it in slot 1, which is probably the primary slot with a big heatsink on the top side, and also in slot 3, which in this case I think is actually on the rear of the motherboard. So obviously, in this case, even with a premium motherboard, you don't get all ports supporting PCI Express 4. You've got at least one on this particular board that is limited to PCI Express 3. So this is also where you will find other information, such as whether a particular slot is PCI Express 5 compatible. And also some other important points are whether installing a particular speed of SSD is going to eat up PCI Express lanes from other ports, or even in some cases will reduce the number of slots or lanes available to your graphics card as well. So it's definitely worth looking at this section to see if there are any particular limitations, which can often happen with budget motherboards. So definitely worth checking out this section. Now, when it comes to installing your SSD, there are a few things that you want to consider. You might want to make sure that it's easy to access, and for that reason, it's not always the best idea to have it located in this slot here or in the slot directly south of your graphics card. So these two slots here, for example, because they're going to be blocked, meaning that you're going to have to remove your graphics card in order to get the SSD out. And that can sometimes be the case with the port up here as well. Usually this one is okay, but if your graphics card, has got a particularly big backplate, or thick backplate, should I say, then you might run into problems. So what I generally do is, if I've got a PCI Express 4 SSD and the slot down here is actually free, then I would probably end up using this one and getting a third-party heatsink for my M.2 SSD. And there's plenty of those available. I've actually done an M.2 group test of heatsinks very recently, so you can check that out. I'll put a link to that in the description below. Obviously, if this slot up here proves okay, then just use this one, which has the heatsink as well. But obviously, also bear in mind that anything around this area is going to get pretty warm, because this is where your graphics card sits, and most graphics cards have fan vents on the sides as well, and that means that they dump out a lot of heat directly towards the motherboard, which means that your M.2 is going to get nice and toasty if it's sitting underneath one of these. Not that much of an issue, but there are some SSDs that do get pretty toasty, such as the WD Black SN850, that can quite easily throttle if you don't use a heatsink on it, or you end up heating the heatsink with your graphics card. So a lot of M.2 SSDs actually come with heatsinks. So here we've got the Crucial T700, which is a PCI Express 5 SSD. So that would go in up here. Now, you have a couple of options if you go for one of these. Number one, with this one, I know for a fact that this one comes without a heatsink as well. So that would be my first choice, because as you can see, there's no comparison between the size of those two heatsinks. The motherboard heatsink is going to cool that thing a lot better because it's a lot bigger. So what I would do is go for the heatsink-less version of one of these and stick that underneath the heatsink. And you've got no other option as to where to install this, because none of the other ports here support PCI Express 5. That will usually persuade you either way. But just remember, if you're buying an M.2 SSD, if it comes with a heatsink, you might actually not want to use it, and there might be a cheaper non-heatsink version available, which might suit your motherboard better if it comes with a large heatsink. Obviously, if your motherboard doesn't come with a heatsink, or if it comes with a really tiny one, like the one here, I mean, this is still pretty big. It's still probably the same sort of heat capacity and cooling capacity there, but you might want to opt for an M.2 SSD if it that comes with a heatsink, because it's not normally that much more expensive to do so, and you know that the manufacturer has hopefully tested it and knows that that heatsink is going to work. So bear in mind then, just to recap there, that you need to work out where you're going to install your M.2 SSD on your board according to which ports support it in terms of PCI Express 3, PCI Express 4 and PCI Express 5. You also need to make sure that it's going to be easy to access because your graphics card might end up blocking it like we saw here. We also have cooling to consider and whether the heatsink is large enough, whether or not you should go for a heatsink equipped SSD, or whether if you're going for another SSD like PCI Express 3 or a slower PCI Express 4 SSD, might even be worth just sticking it down at the bottom end of the board, just so it's out of the way of everything. It's probably not going to run that hot, doesn't really need a heatsink, and you're just going to make your life a lot easier if it's just mounted somewhere like that. So, in terms of actually installing your SSD, there aren't too many things to consider, but there are some heatsinks that have really cool features such as tool-free designs, and I absolutely love those because they just require none of the small fiddly screws and all that kind of stuff to deal with. They just clip into place and you're done. I absolutely love that, and MSI has a couple of those features on its more premium motherboards, or just different to the ones that we've got here. Here though, we've got some pretty standard motherboard heatsinks. So what we'll do is we'll have a look at this this small one first and see what we've got under here. So thankfully these are captive screws in this heatsink. So actually I need to remove that one a little more to get it off. So the captive screws, basically they can't be unscrewed from the heatsink, because one of my pet hates is when you just get the small screws that do come loose. I have lost so many of those things, so just be super, super careful when you do this that you don't lose the screws, because they are often proprietary to the motherboard and you can't get replacements that will fit exactly or fit in with the color scheme. So now we've removed it, the only other thing we need to do is to remove the protective layer on the thermal pad underneath. So the protective layer is just there to stop damage occurring to this thermal pad. If you see here, if I just tap it, it's going to get damaged, and that's not too much of a problem. But if this scrapes along something or you drop it, it could potentially damage that thermal pad beyond repair. And the thermal pad is really important because it's designed to sit at a certain height so it touches your SSD. It's also there to provide thermal contact from the SSD to your heatsink. So we've removed that now, so we can go ahead and install our SSD, but not before I talk about one other issue, which is, do you remove the label from your SSD? Now, I've been asked this a lot of times in my M.2 SSD heatsinks, and I'm generally of the opinion that you do not need to remove the label. And in fact, I'd say that you shouldn't remove it, even if you want the best temperatures for your M.2 SSD. And there are a few reasons for that. Number one, it doesn't really improve the thermals that much. You might see an extra 5 or 10 degrees shaved off the temperatures, but you got to remember, is that going to improve the performance of the SSD? No, it's not. More often than not, if a heatsink is not able to cope with an M.2 SSD, that's a limitation of the heatsink and not the thermal transfer between the M.2 SSD and that heatsink. So you're not going to be gaining any more performance by removing this label. So the other reasons why I wouldn't want to remove the label is that you can actually damage the M.2 SSD in doing so if you start picking at things, and there are lots of delicate components on this M.2 SSD which are easily damaged if you end up kind of picking at things with like a plastic pick or a screwdriver or something like that. It's just not worth it. And also, if you're going to sell it again, I would want to buy something that is like this and not one that has had the label removed and probably some residue on there and all that kind of stuff. So just think very, very carefully about why you want to remove it, because the simple reason is you still see much lower temperature results for the M.2 SSD, this one included. If you just keep the label on there but put a decent heatsink on it, you'll still see a massive reduction in temperatures, and that's all you want. You don't want the SSD to be as cool as possible because it will not improve the performance or the longevity, really. So that's just my 2 cents on the labels. So we are now finally going to install our M.2 SSD, and it's worth just looking at your motherboard to see what the options are when it comes to actually installing it. The more basic motherboards will have a screw that screws into one of these ports here, and they're very, very tiny. They're usually included in a little bag in your motherboard box. However, more recently, we actually get more tool-free fittings, and this is where it becomes a lot easier, because all I have to do with this motherboard, for example, the MSI B760M Gaming Plus Wi-Fi, is to slot the M.2 SSD in there. So you kind of push it in at a slight angle, like so, drop it down, and down here, you've got like a very small latch that you just swing down over the top of the SSD like that. So we've kind of rotated it about 180 degrees. That's enough to lock it in place, and that's all you need to do. So if we just see how quickly you can actually do that, going from no SSD in the slot, whack it in, place it down, lock it over. I guess that's about 5 seconds or something like that. So super, super easy. It's definitely worth looking for those latches on your motherboard. Some motherboards also have tool-free heatsinks as well, and they're super, super easy to use. The other option is, of course, that you need to use the little screws and also maybe some small standoffs if you want to use these slots down here. So you'll get all the components that you need to do that in your motherboard box. So now all we have to do is install the heatsink, and we've already removed the thermal pad from underneath, and we just have to line up the screws and then screw the heatsink on. So what I would do is don't tighten up one side fully before you've tightened up the other one. So notice there I had a little bit of slack on this one on the right hand side, which enabled me to get that screw in there. And that is your M.2 SSD installed. To measure your M.2 SSD's temperature under load, we need two free bits of software. Firstly, CPU ID hardware monitor, which will show you the temperature, and Crystal Disk Mark on the right here, which will put your SSD under a benchmark condition for a period of time and allow us to get some accurate readings of temperatures. So to start with, we've got a peak temperature on the left of 58 degrees C for our crucial T700 PCI Express 5 SSD. But if we move to removing the heatsink and using our motherboard's heatsink, with that temperature actually falls to 54 degrees C. Now, is that going to make a difference in the real world? Absolutely not. It's 4 degrees C is a very, very small difference. You might see more depending on your particular setup, you might see less. But in general, in this situation, it's not enough to opt for the SSD that comes with the heatsink. So I would much rather save 15 or 20 pounds for the SSD or the version of the crucial T700 that comes without a heatsink, rather than to get one with a heatsink, given that my motherboard here, even with a comparatively modest heatsink on this motherboard, I should add, is able to cool the SSD better than the stock heatsink that it comes with. So worth bearing in mind, and also just worth running this benchmark to see for yourself whether the heatsink that your SSD comes with, if you decide to go for one, is better or worse at cooling than the heatsink on your motherboard. So hopefully after watching today's video, M.2 SSDs are a little less scary than they were before you started watching it. That was my aim today anyway. Hopefully I've broken down the key points that you need to consider when you're buying a new SSD, or if you're buying a new motherboard and you want to transplant an older SSD into it, whether it's worth doing that or whether you should buy new, and the things that you need to consider, such as the PCI Express bus, speed or standard that your motherboard and SSD are compatible with, which port you need to put it into, temperatures, and all of that kind of stuff. So that's it from me today. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and comment on this video. Love hearing what you guys think of it. And also, if you've got any comments, feel free to comment below as well. Just all helps with the engagement. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel. It means a lot to have your support and just helps punch me up the algorithm and gets me noticed. And also, if you want to thank me for today's video, you can do so using the thank button just below the video, or you can even buy me a coffee using the link in the description. So thanks for watching today, and I'll be back very, very soon.